In pro wrestling, we often hear about this infamous plane ride from hell, a flight with WWE superstars that would have been chaotic and during which a lot of shocking things would have happened. It is a series of incidents that clearly had an impact on the image of some wrestlers, and that speaks volumes about all the vices that can exist in the sports entertainment industry. So here's what we are going to do. We'll dive back into this infernal flight to find out exactly what we're talking about, and above all, we'll look together at why this is much more than just another scandal in the wrestling business, but really something that raises many questions. You are on the wrestling paradise. Why the plane ride from hell is fascinating. Let's go.
This is such good shit.
First of all, let me start by asking you a question. Who can sit at my table and tell me I know what happened on the plane ride from hell? Except all those who were present on the plane, no one. But we still have information. Already this flight, what is it? What is the context? Why are we talking about it so much? In fact, in May 2002, the WWE has just finished a tour of Europe, which concluded with the Insurrection pay-per-view at the Wembley Arena in London, an exclusive show of Monday Night Raw, in which there was notably a Triple H against The Undertaker, a Stone Cold Steve Austin against The Big Show, and a certain Brock Lesnar, who had only been in the main roster for a few weeks for your information. For the record, Insurrection was even the very last show before the WWF officially became the WWE, as a symbol of a whole era of wrestling that ended. So this tour was coming to an end, and at the time the wrestlers were always happy to go and do shows in Europe because the crowds were really boiling and they were always very well paid. And in this tour, Vince McMahon, the big boss, had done something for his wrestlers which was still quite new at that time. We can say that on this occasion he took care of them. He had rented and privatized a Boeing 757 plane. It therefore meant that the employees of the Federation would not be on commercial flights, and that, in this European tour, they would travel from city to city on a plane, in which there would be only WWE staff, the wrestlers, the officials, the production team, the costume designers. The plane was entirely for them, with of course a crew at their service. And it was really a 5-star plane, since there were about 50 leather armchairs, sofas, a carpet floor, all the food they wanted, and there were no civilians on board. And no civilians means no witnesses, except the crew. An important detail for the rest, hang on tight. To have a really complete picture of this situation, it should also be noted that on this plane, there was in particular an open bar, which was loaded in terms of alcoholic beverages. Just after the Insurrection show, after a successful European tour, it was time to take the plane to cross the Atlantic Ocean and go back to the United States. So we imagine a group of tired wrestlers on a plane exclusively for them, with unlimited alcohol, knowing that many of these wrestlers were heavy drinkers. To illustrate how important the alcohol consumption had been during this flight, we learned, for example, that even before the plane took off, 3 trolleys filled with normal-sized bottles had already been completely consumed. Also knowing that there had been a delay and that they remained on the tarmac for 7 hours, which left the passengers plenty of time to drink and be completely drunk for the long flight over the Atlantic Ocean. Imagine that this is something that Heidi Doyle, one of the flight attendants we will have the opportunity to talk about again, had never seen before in her career and has not seen again since. Can you only imagine a plane full of drunk wrestlers? And besides, they were mixing alcohol with pills. So initially it was fun. Mr. Perfect and Scott Hall were putting shaving foam on their colleagues' heads. Gerald Briscoe, one of the officials, wanted to give hugs and kisses to everyone. There was Stone Cold Steve Austin and his wife Deborah Marshall, who watched a movie and then slept during the entire flight. And yet it escalated, so prepare to be shocked, because the thing that makes this plane ride from hell so fascinating is the crazy stories we learned about this flight over the Atlantic Ocean. For example, we have the incredible story between Brock Lesnar and Mr. Perfect. At that time, Brock was only 24 years old, and he was still fairly new to the Stamford Federation. But that doesn't mean people should bother Lesnar, and the legend Mr. Perfect was able to realize it. In real life, the two men were friends since they were both from Minnesota, and they were traveling together to go do the shows. And they had one thing in common in their personalities: they were two competitors. We could hear several explanations about the origin of this confrontation on the plane. Some claim that Mr. Perfect was telling Brock that he was a better wrestler than him, while the Conqueror had still been National University Wrestling Champion not so long ago, and that they therefore verified it. Others say that Mr. Perfect was making Brock angry by throwing alcohol in his face while he was trying to sleep. In any case, whatever the origin of this story was, Brock ended up running after the veteran in the corridor of the plane. While at first, They were grappling, as they say, from a purely athletic perspective. It became more and more intense, and they got closer to the emergency exit. In this frenzy, Brock began to attack Mr. Perfect by ramming him against the emergency exit. They caused panic on board because Lesnar was putting a lot of energy into his attacks, and even if, in principle, the emergency exit was locked and therefore could not be opened, people were afraid that they would shrivel the door and fall into the void several miles above sea level, and other passengers could even have been sucked in. Fortunately, they ended up being separated by Triple H, Finlay, and Paul Heyman. In the end, Mr. Perfect will be considered responsible, and he will be fired in the process. Another case, and the best is coming. On that plane, there was the man named Michael Hayes, an official that many wrestlers didn't like too much. And that day, Hayes had drunk too much. On this plane, where we imagine that he had fully enjoyed the open bar, he was completely drunk, and alcohol made him aggressive, noisy, and obnoxious. Apparently, according to witnesses at the scene, Michael Hayes even almost committed an absolutely mind-blowing act. He allegedly tried to pull his penis out of his pants and urinate on Linda McMahon, Vince's wife. We could learn that he was so intoxicated that he thought he was in the toilet, and he kept saying the phrase, "Wait a minute, wait a minute." Can you only imagine wanting to defecate on the boss's wife? And that's not even all. Michael Hayes finally moved away, and in his alcoholic adventure, if we can call it that, he saw that JBL, who would soon become one of the best heels of the Ruthless Aggression era, was asleep in his armchair with a bandage on his head. The reason why he had this bandage is very simple. He just had his forehead cut open at the Insurrection show against X-Pac. So, seeing that, Hayes was crazy again. He approached JBL, shouting, "Hey, you freaking redneck." And while JBL was sleeping and enjoying a well-deserved rest after his match, the official approached him and had the very bad idea of punching him right on the spot of his injury while he was sleeping. Do you realize how overwhelmed JBL must have been to be woken up like this? As you might expect, he started bleeding profusely again, and the suit that JBL was wearing ended up stained with blood. After that, he punched Michael Hayes, who was immediately knocked out, and who then was out until the landing. And we can say that he was punished. X-Pac, who was also logically on the plane, and who also had enough of Hayes because he was burying him in production meetings, asked for scissors. And in front of a delirious audience, he cut Michael's mullet, which he will only realize at the airport customs. Another story that makes this flight fascinating is the one of Scott Hall, and it is darker. So we remember the shaving foam with Mr. Perfect, but then, when one of the flight attendants, Heidi Doyle, offered him breakfast, Scott would have grabbed her by the shirt, telling her that he was going to lick her vagina. He also allegedly told Terri Capilano, another flight attendant, to do him a sexual favor that you can easily guess. While Heidi was scared, all of a sudden Scott Hall lost consciousness and was completely out for the rest of the flight, to a point where they even took his pulse to check that he was alive. In the end, he will still be out at the airport, where he will be pushed in a wheelchair, and then in the process, he will be fired. Another wrestler who also caused a stir in this infernal flight is Dustin Rhodes, who we know in particular for his Goldust character and who is the half-brother of Cody Rhodes. Already, he would not have hesitated to hit on one of the flight attendants. Indeed, Terri Capilano told that the son of the legend Dusty Rhodes would tell him that they were going to have sex to stay correct. However, on this same flight, Dustin also had what looks like a moment of nostalgia and love for his ex-wife Terri Runnels, who was also on board. At one point, he managed to take control of the speakers on the plane, and he took the opportunity to sing a serenade for Terri, in this case the song Pledging My Love by country singer David Allan Coe. Quite naturally, this is something that woke up all the people who were sleeping, including Terri. She says she was really terrified when she heard this, knowing that they had been divorced for 3 years. At that moment, she met the gaze of Paul Heyman, who motioned to her not to react to Dustin's serenade. She then immediately went back to sleep, and Dustin Rhodes stopped when Jim Ross yelled at him. And finally, one last story about this fascinating flight where nothing but incredible things happened is the one about the nature boy Ric Flair. That day, on the plane, Ric was in a playful mood because he did something there that some of his colleagues said he used to do: walk around in the airplane corridor wearing a robe and being completely naked underneath. And at that moment, his little game was to open his robe in front of people by doing his iconic woo and proudly show off his penis, even going so far as to do the helicopter with it, and the stewardesses on the plane were entitled to it. And that's where Ric Flair would have gone too far. At the moment when the hostess Heidi was in the kitchen, Ric would have come to get a drink, but right after, he would have forced Heidi to touch his penis and licked her face while she asked him to stop. These incidents will push the two stewardesses to file a complaint against Flair for sexual assault. According to the Nature Boy himself, there would be no truth behind these accusations. although the Stamford Federation would eventually come to an agreement with them so that the case would not end in court. At that moment, we can think this plane ride from hell was crazy. But it is by taking a step back on it, by asking ourselves certain questions, by knowing other information, that it becomes even more fascinating. Already a question: should Jim Ross, who was in charge of talent, have kept this situation under control more? Was it his responsibility to make sure that wrestlers didn't take pills and drank much less alcohol? And more generally, was it a good idea to have a plane just for them with a lot of alcohol? These are real questions that arise, and we come to take a step back even more. Many wrestlers at the time had addictions and fell into vices, also because the lifestyle was infernal. We are indeed talking about a global era when the treatment of injuries was different, when wrestlers were not yet surrounded by doctors, and where there were not concussion protocols yet, where internal competition was tough. We could say that addictions, which are actually loopholes, and their consequences were something inevitable for wrestlers at the time, because the life they had was difficult. Should they have had a less extreme schedule where they don't wrestle every day and been more taken care of in terms of health by their employers? Also remembering this is not specific to the WWE, since for several decades all this was normal in the wrestling world. Would these scandals have happened with modern conditions, for example, where there is more emphasis on the safety and health of performers? In any case, just incredible. Who was on the plane says that Vince McMahon could have been in a lot more trouble with this infernal flight, that someone could have died on this plane. But who is to blame in this story? The wrestlers who can't manage themselves and who no longer realize the consequences of their actions, or the company who put them into a lifestyle that was already toxic just to make as much money as possible? But what is absolutely crazy is that there are wrestlers from that time who say that if we found this plane ride from hell shocking and wild, we should have seen other flights they were on. Apparently there would have been many other infernal flights, and even worse than this one. As for X-Pac, he says that everything that happened on this plane is not even part of the 10 craziest flights he has experienced, which were in addition commercial flights, so with normal passengers. If a flight with several people who were out because of drugs and alcohol, with fights and especially sexual assaults apparently, is not even one of the craziest he has experienced, what were the other flights like? What other vices have been common in the wrestling world for years, at a time when there were not yet smartphones and social media, and where everything was not known? Clearly, this is a terrible idea. And that's why this plane ride from hell is fascinating. It's a bit of a symbol of a time when wrestling was full of depravity, perversity, addictions, and drugs. And let me ask you one last question, and it will make you think: if there had been social media and smartphones at the time of the plane ride from hell, which wrestlers would still have the same popularity? Now you know why I find the plane ride from hell fascinating. Come and give your opinion in the comments if you are shocked by these incidents, or if on the contrary you were not so surprised, if your perception of some wrestlers may have evolved. In any case, the whole idea is to talk about it together, to exchange our opinions with respect, of course. We're here to share our passion, and that's the most important thing. We can say that this plane ride was really outrageous. I hope you had a good time watching this video, and I invite you to stay on the Paradise of Wrestling to look at some other ones. See you right away.
And that's the bottom line, 'cause Stone Cold said so. What?